Hello everyone and welcome to our Site 3103 Field Methods in Psychology class. And for today's lecture, I'm going to talk about the epistemology or the theories or worldviews about doing research. And before we start, let me introduce myself. So I'm Nisin Sensei, and this is my VTuber avatar. So her name is VTuber Sensei. And she will be the stand-in for your video lectures in replace of my face. So this is how I do my video lectures. So I'm a VTuber too. And I hope that in this video lectures that I'm going to share, you will learn a lot about doing research, especially qualitative research. So this is also one of the important skills that you psychology students must learn. So this is based on Creswell's book, and I recommend you really to read more about it. I put it there in your modules. So without further ado, let's do our lesson. Everything starts with an assumption in research. So when you say assumptions in research, so this is a set of guidelines or beliefs in doing your research work. So it is divided into three parts, as you can see here: the elements of inquiry, the research approaches, and of course, how do we design the research studies. So at first, in the elements of inquiry, we have here the alternative knowledge claims, or what we call the epistemology or the worldviews behind doing research. Then strategies of inquiry. How do we formulate the research questions? And of course, the methods behind it. This alternative knowledge claims, strategies of inquiry, and methods will form into the three approaches. We will now choose which approaches will we take based on the three elements of inquiry. And of course, here we also anchored the importance of theory or conceptualizing a theory. So this will also depend on what research approach we're gonna take. And of course, after choosing which research approach we're gonna take, there's now the practice or applications when it comes to doing the research. And here we have formulated, of course, the research questions, which theoretical lens we are going to view our research from, the data collection methods, how do we collect the data, what approach, and as well as how do we analyze these data. And of course, we're going to know or learn how do we write results, and as well as how do we validate those research results. So this is part of the research design section. So we start first at the elements of inquiry. In knowing which worldview do we anchor upon our research, we now choose what approach to take, and then we're finally going to design the research. But since we are here in field methods in psychology, we're gonna focus more on the qualitative research method. In this lesson, I'm just going to give you a background. Why do we do, for example, quantitative research? What's the worldview or belief behind it? And of course, then how about the qualitative one? So we're gonna look into how we shift now our perspective from the quantitative side of things. We're now going into another lens, another view, which is the qualitative one. And of course, I'm going to discuss also the beliefs or worldviews behind the mixed methods, but we're not going to do mixed methods. I'm just going to give a background behind it. So next is, of course, the different knowledge claims or alternative knowledge claims or worldviews behind the different research approaches that we're going to study. So when we say alternative knowledge claims, this is also what I called a worldview or the epistemology behind doing research. So when you say a worldview, it means that it's a basic set of beliefs that guide action. So it is also known as paradigms. It is also known as epistemologies or ontologies behind doing research. And in the three research approaches, there are four worldviews or paradigms behind it. In the quantitative side, in quantitative approach, there is what we call post-positivism. So in post-positivism, we will discuss that later, but this is the most common. We are most familiar with it. The next is the Constructivism under qualitative approaches, and advocacy or participatory worldview. So we will also discuss that and why now in qualitative research we're going to anchor our beliefs based on either constructivism or advocacy or participatory worldview. And of course, the mixed method. And under the mixed method approaches, we have the pragmatism worldview. So try to memorize and understand the different worldviews so that you have a better appreciation of why we do research. So under post-positivism, so it is also known as the scientific method or the empirical science, positivism, post-positivism, or quantitative research. So like I said, this is what we are most familiar with because this is what we have grown up with ever since we were children. So we were introduced to the scientific method of inquiry. And of course, these are based on objective reality. It is also the traditional form of research. So when we say that you're a post-positivist, it means that you hold a deterministic philosophy in which causes probably determine effects or outcomes. So it's more on, which is the first characteristic of post-positivist, is more on determination. So meaning looking into the causes and outcomes. So during your experimental psychology, you learned the differences between causation and correlation, right? And in doing experimental research, like through experiments, you would like to control those variables to know if a certain variable A really causes variable V. So that's post-positivist, and that is the approach that is usually used there is the quantitative method or approach. So post-positivism, another characteristic of it is reductionism. So it means reducing the ideas into variables that constitute a hypothesis and questions. So when you say reductionism, so like my example earlier, you have there a variable A, comparing variable A, your independent variable to your dependent variable. So you want to know if your independent variable A really causes the dependent variable B. And based on that, you try to prove a hypothesis. Like examples of it are whether there is a significant difference between variable A and variable B, or there is a significant relationship between variable A and variable B. And another characteristic, or the third characteristic of post-positivism, is of course empirical observation and measurement. They are leaning more on the objective reality, what we see, what we feel, what we taste, what we hear. It's not talking about the subjective meaning behind certain experiences. It's more of carefully observing the objective reality or what's out there. And last characteristic of post-positivism is of course theory verification. So it begins with a theory. In post-positivist method, you use a deductive type of reasoning. You have a theory to anchor upon your study, and then with that theory, you're trying to prove whether that theory is correct or not. So you begin with the theory, and then you collect your data, and once you analyze your data, you try to support that theory or you try to refute or revise it. So that's the post-positivist side of or view of doing research. So next is, of course, the constructivist side. in doing research, or constructivism. So what is social constructivism or constructivism? So when we say that you are a social constructivist, it means that you hold assumptions that individuals seek understanding of the world in which they live and work. So individuals develop a subjective meaning to their experiences, meanings directed towards certain objects or things. So that's why I ask you during our laboratory sessions, what is your story? What is your story about being a student? And of course, how do you find meaning in doing research? So it's more of understanding. So that's the first characteristic of a constructivist worldview. So you try to understand how individuals see the world they live in. How do they see the world? So like, for example, how do you see yourself as a student? Okay? Now that you're in third year, how do you interpret the challenges that are happening to you? So that's the understanding characteristic. Another characteristic is, of course, the multiple participant meaning. So individuals develop a subjective meanings to their experiences. Okay, so it's more of what does it mean to have experienced this one. So usually if you see the title lived experiences of a certain group of people, so it means that how do they develop meaning? What is the essence of their understanding of their current situation? So that's multiple participant meanings. Okay, so individuals develop subjective meanings to their experiences. So we may differ in subjective experiences, but having this constructivist worldview, you try to interpret or you try to find the essence behind it. And another characteristic of it is the social and historical construction. So subjective meanings are negotiated socially and historically through interaction with others. So this is where we develop social constructs. So certain terms, like for example, gender. Yeah. What is the meaning of gender? Right? So there are different interpretations on how we view gender. And in the constructivist perspective, they do not rely on, of course, what is the objective meaning of gender, but more of the subjective ones. So, and it's also linked socially and historically. So we can see that the meaning of gender change throughout time, right? And the last characteristic of it is theory generation. So unlike the deductive reasoning of the post-positivist one, wherein we have a theory and then we try to prove that theory, this is more of theory generation. So the research aims to develop a theory. This is more of the inductive side. So with the data that we collect, we try to analyze and interpret it so that we can form a theory on it later on, in which we can see a pattern of meaning. So that is the constructivist worldview. Okay, so again, post-positivist leans more on the objective reality. I think that's the best summary. And usually that is the quantitative side of things, quantitative approach. You use that. And you have, in the post-positivist, you have a theory that you need to prove, okay, or disprove. In constructivist, it's more of understanding, more of meaning. And the meanings, of course, may change over time. And it's leaning more on inductive side and theory generation. When we develop a theory, we try to see patterns in it. So that's the goal of course, constructivist worldview. So we also have advocacy or participatory worldview. When we say that you have an advocacy or participatory worldview, it holds that research inquiry needs to be intertwined with politics or political agenda. So usually, if you have a advocacy or participatory worldview, the type of researches that you do is usually containing a action agenda for reform that may change the lives of participants, the institutions in which the individuals work or live, and the researcher's life. So, if you notice, in the cyberspace or in the internet today, we can see how people are politically active nowadays than ever before. And the trend now is you need to choose a side, political sides. If you observe, of course, our world around us. And that is because of the rise or awareness of activism. And when we do research with a worldview about advocacy or participatory, besides understanding a certain event, it's more of a call to action. With the research results that you have, what will you now do in the real world or in society? So, the different characteristics of advocacy or participatory knowledge claim or worldview is that, in their view, for them, post-positivist researches, the theories behind them are more marginalizing. Okay, so that's their perspective. So, post-positivists try to limit, and usually for them, their argument is that usually post-positivist research are anchored on the middle-aged, white, heteronormative perspective. Those are their samples that usually post-positivists get from. So they are not really representative of certain minorities such as the LGBT or other races. So that's what the view of the advocacy or participatory perspectives. That's why the first characteristic of it is that it is political. So research needs to be intertwined with politics and political agenda. So you can see there the rise of LGBT-centered researches, feminist-centered researches. So it's more on, of course, you need to have a political agenda to prove a political agenda when you do advocacy or participatory research. And another is, of course, it's more of empowerment. Okay, empowerment issue oriented. So specific social issues need to be addressed. Like, for example, inequality. Okay, so those researchers under advocacy or participatory try to look into factors about inequality. Like, for example, what are the factors that a certain race of people are not getting the privilege that the majority of that race have? Okay, so it's more of empowerment. Okay, raising awareness or voice towards inequality or something like that. So next is it is collaborative. So research includes participants as researchers or collaborators. So in the qualitative side or in what we call the constructivist worldview, we as researchers are separate from the participants. But here in the advocacy or participatory, we, the researchers and the participants work together. It's more of a collaborative effort. And there's also a change-oriented. So at the end, I think at the end of your research, it's more of giving the participants a voice. More of consciousness, raising awareness. It's more for the advancing of an agenda. So that's the advocacy or participatory worldview. Okay? So that's why if you journal articles about LGBT studies or about feminism studies, so these are more on the advocacy or participatory worldview. So what are the different perspectives when it comes to advocacy or participatory worldview? So, of course, like I mentioned, feminist perspectives. So they problematize women's diverse situations and oppressive context. So they try to, their agenda is more of how does the patriarchy or a patriarchal society marginalize women. So that's their view. And most of the researches are anchored upon that. And of course, there is also radicalized discourses. They question control and production of knowledge, especially knowledge of people of color. Or sorry, not radicalized, but racialized discourses. So like, why is it that white people have more privilege than people of color? And what are some discrimination that the people of color face in? Okay, based on the color of the skin or the race. So that's racialized discourses, more talk about race, something like that. And of course, critical theory. So it asks how human beings can be empowered and transcend constraints due to race, class, and gender. So this is one of the popular theories or worldviews out there that is being taught in universities in America right now. How race, class, gender divides people, and as well as how race or class and gender divides people and discriminates people from getting certain privileges or rights. So there's also, of course, queer theory. And this is more on giving voice to lesbians, gays, bisexual, and transgender individuals. So this is what the certain LGBT studies are anchored upon. It's more on the queer theory. And of course, there's also the disability inquiry, and it addresses the meaning of inclusion for individuals with disability. So overall, if you look at our world today, so most of the time, the message right now, the message that is being said into the world, especially or propagated, especially in social media, is all about diversity and inclusion. And this is, of course, anchored upon this worldview of advocacy or participatory worldview. And these are the different perspectives in which those whose philosophy is all about diversity and inclusion are anchored upon. So this is more of an awareness for us. Of course, the last worldview that I'm going to discuss is the pragmatic worldview. In the pragmatic worldview, and when we say pragmatism, so it's a worldview that arises out of actions, situations, and consequences rather than antecedent conditions, or as in postpositivism. And there's a concern with applications or what works and solutions to problem. Pragmatic, okay, it's more of practical, the practicality of researches. Okay, it's more centered on results than knowing the causes. Okay, so that's the difference between post-positivist side and the pragmatic side. Post-positive side views it on what causes a certain phenomena. Pragmatic side is more on the results, more on action-based. When we do a certain research or when we develop a certain program, did it work? So it's more of that. Did it have change? So what are the characteristics of pragmatic worldview or pragmatic alternative knowledge claims? So first is the consequences of actions. This knowledge claim arise out of actions, situations, and consequences rather than antecedent conditions. So it's, like I said earlier, it's not all about what causes a certain phenomena, but what is the result of a certain action. It is also problem-centered. The concern is on what works or on applications and solutions to problems. So an example of this is more on, for example, the effectiveness of a certain treatment or a certain therapy. So those are the types of researches that are usually conducted in a pragmatic worldview. So it's also pluralistic. So researchers use all approaches to understand the problem. So it's not only limited to objective reality, but also subjective reality, meanings behind it. So pluralistic. And of course, real world practice oriented. Truth is what works at that time. So, what is effective? What is the proper solution to a certain problem? So, that's the pragmatic approach. Okay? So, like for example, if we are going to develop a certain therapy for a certain disorder, okay? So, the truth is what works or what was effective during that research or during that program that we created. So, now, of course, we go into the strategies of inquiry. So, this is more of what research methods. Okay, so the research approaches are quanti, quali, and mix, right? So under that are the strategies of inquiry. So how do we now do it? So first is under quanti, of course, are the experimental designs and non-experimental designs. And in your subject, experimental psychology, you learned about different kinds of experimental methods. And there's even the true experimental method and of course the quasi-experimental methods. And you also are exposed to the non-experimental designs such as of course surveys. So those are under the quantitative method. Now, in the qualitative method, so there are really a lot of strategies of inquiry under quali. And it's because it depends on how you create the question or how you inquire the question. So there are narratives, there are phenomenologies, there are ethnographies, grounded theory, case studies. So these are all qualitative approaches to inquiry. Okay? And of course, we have mixed method. So under mixed method, we have sequential, concurrent, and transformative. So like I said, our focus here is not really on the quantitative side or the mixed method side. What we are going to focus is more on the strategies of inquiry in the qualitative method. So later on in our modules, you will present or discuss the different research designs that are under qualitative or different inquiry methods that are under qualitative approach. And I hope that you will gain an understanding and appreciation to them. Under quantitative, we have the experimental methods. So these are the two experiments, your quasi-experiments, your correlational studies, and structural equation models. So just remember that in experimental method, it's more on looking on the causation or the correlation of certain variables. And there's also surveys. So this is a use of questionnaires or structured interviews for data collection with the intent of generalizing from a sample to a population. So usually in surveys, you try to look into what is popular, what is usually the trends, okay? You use surveys for that. But if you want to know if there are certain differences between certain groups of people or trying to correlate if a certain behavior, okay, has a correlation with another behavior or another variable, so you use the experimental method. And you already encountered this when you were in second year. So in qualitative methods, so there are 5 here. So the first one is of course ethnographies. So studies of intact cultural groups in their natural setting over a prolonged period. So this is a strategy of inquiry in which the researcher studies an intact cultural group in a natural setting over a prolonged period of time by collecting primarily observational and interview data. This research process is flexible and typically evolves contextually in response to the lived realities encountered in the field setting. I think the best example that I could give about ethnography is Filipino psychology or Psikolohiyang Filipino. If you look at the method of inquiry of Psikolohiyang Filipino, it's more of psychology from within, right? Coming out from within. How do Filipinos interpret this certain behavior. It's more of a certain cultural group. So that's why the focus of ethnographies is looking into the culture, okay, in their natural setting. For example, Ilonggos, are they really, because those in Manila or those in Luzon or in other parts of the country say that we Ilonggos are quote-unquote tikalon or very boastful. So is that really true? Okay, what is our interpretation of being or the word tikal, okay, or tikalon, right? So that's ethnography, more of the culture. We're looking into the culture of that certain group of people. So next is grounded theory. So grounded theory is a strategy of inquiry in which the researcher derives a general abstract theory of a process or action or interaction grounded in the views of the participants. So this process involves using multiple stages of data collection and the refinement of the interrelationship of categories of information. So two primary characteristics of this design are the constant comparison of data with emerging categories and theoretical samplings of different groups to maximize similarities and the differences of information. So in grounded theory, the goal here is to really come up with a theory that would explain a certain phenomena based on the perspective of the participants. So just a tip for you, class. As a beginner in qualitative research, we're not really going to do this, the ethnographies, the grounded theories. So this is more of the PhD side, more advanced. But I'm just giving you awareness on how do we do this or what are these certain research designs that are under qualitative research. So don't be intimidated by them. So yeah, so in grounded theory, the goal here is to come up or conceptualize a theory that will explain the different processes of that certain phenomena that is happening in the view or with the participants' viewpoint. So case studies. So this is an in-depth exploration of an event, activity, process of one or more individuals. So cases are bound by time and activity, and researchers collect detailed information using a variety of data collection procedures over a sustained period of time. So I think the best example that I could give to you is, for example, you want to look into a case study of a person who has a certain mental disorder. Okay, so you try to observe his behaviors, collect data from the diaries or from the interview. So you're trying to look in depth about that person's life. So it's usually one or more individuals and it's usually in depth. There's a really thick exploration or thick processing of data or explaining of the data or the phenomenon. So there's also phenomenological research. So it's a strategy of inquiry in which the researcher identifies the essence of human experiences about a phenomenon as described by participants. Understanding the lived experiences marks phenomenology as a philosophy as well as research method. And the procedure involves studying a small number of subjects through extensive and prolonged engagement to develop patterns and relationships of meaning. In this process, the researcher brackets or sets aside his own experiences in order to understand those of the participants in the study. So you're trying to look into the meaning or the essence of their experiences. I think one of my best examples are the researches of my current mentees. So the research is about the lived experiences of the pioneer graduates of CPU Psych in the new curriculum. What is the meaning behind their experiences? And another one of the researches of my mentees is the lived experiences of those female who were rejected, okay, romantically rejected by their friends or their male best friends. So it's all about friend zone? What's the meaning of friend zone? Something like that. So it's more on the understanding of their lived experiences and trying to see the essence behind them. What's the meaning behind their experiences? So you as beginner qualitative researchers, so we're gonna look more or develop more your skills on phenom research. So another or last is of course narrative research. It's the retelling of the individual life stories. This strategy of inquiry in which the researcher studies the lives of individuals and asks one or more individuals to provide stories about their lives. This information is then often retold or restored by the researcher into a narrative chronology. In the end, the narrative combines views from the participant's life with those of the researcher's life in a collaborative narrative. So, my master's thesis is actually a narrative research. I look into understanding and analyzing the stories of children in conflict with the law. So, what is their life story? I look into that. The end results of my research is that I look into the plot. Okay, what is their life story about? What's their life before they come into the institution? Then the second one is their experiences during their time in the institution, and of course after. What would they dream or their future lives? Something like that. So don't worry, I'm gonna present some examples so that you can, during the course or during the lab session, I'm gonna see some examples so that you can, how do these certain researches work. Okay? And of course, we have the mixed methods. So in mixed methods, so there are of course 3. And like I said, mixed method is of course a combination of the quantitative and qualitative approaches. So it's less well known. And there are 3 procedures on how to conduct mixed methods. So the first one is of course sequential. So procedures are those in which the researcher seeks to elaborate on or expand on the findings of one method with another method. So this may involve beginning with a qualitative interview for exploratory purposes, then following it up with a quantitative survey method with a large sample so that the researcher can generalize results to a population. Alternatively, the study may begin with a quantitative method in which a theory or concept is tested, then followed by a qualitative method involving detailed exploration with few cases or individuals. So, in sequential method, either you first start with a quali method to a small group of people and then you use quanti to generalize the results that you got from the first procedure, and then, or you can use the quanti first to test out certain theory or from a general population, and then you try to expand upon the results of the quantitative research with a qualitative method to understand more why certain phenomena happen to those group of people. Okay, this is more of in support of the quantitative and qualitative, or qualitative to quantitative. So that's the sequential. So it's sequential because you first do one procedure before you do another procedure. So when say concurrent, so you collect both quali and quanti data and at the same time integrate information in the interpretation of the results. So procedures are those in which the researcher converges or merges quantitative and qualitative data in order to provide a comprehensive analysis of the research problem. In this design, the investigator collects both forms of data at the same time and then integrates the information in the interpretation of overall results. Also, in this design, the researcher may embed one smaller form of data within another larger data collection in order to analyze different types of questions. So, the qualitative addresses the process while the quantitative the outcome. So, concurrent, you collect quantitative and qualitative data at the same time and then you try to integrate them. So, that's concurrent. So, last is transformative. So, in transformative, procedures are those in which the researcher uses a theoretical lens as an overarching perspective within a design that contains both quantitative and qualitative data. So this lens provides a framework for topics of interest, methods for collecting data, and outcomes and or changes anticipated by the study. So within this lens could be a data collection method that involves sequential or a concurrent approach. So in transformative, you have a theory, theory that provides you a framework, and the method of data collection contains both quali and quanti data. So in transformative procedure, the goal still here is to try to prove or disprove the theory. Okay, so you have a theory there that you try to prove or disprove, and then you use quali and quanti data to support or disprove that theory. Okay, so what are now the methods in getting our data? Okay, so in quantitative, so it's predetermined. Okay, it's also instrument-based and usually use closed-ended questions. So what data usually we gather are performance data, attitude data, observational data, and census data. And of course, we use statistical analysis to get our results based on the data. So in qualitative, it's more of an emerging method. So it means that the question, so for example, your research question will change depending on the results of the data. And it uses open-ended questions. Okay, so the difference between closed-ended and open-ended questions is that in close-ended questions, it's usually answered by yes or no, or there's a certain limited number of choices that the participants are going to answer. In open-ended questions, on the other hand, it's more of the participants explaining it freely. There is no right or wrong answers also. So the different data that we can get from qualitative are, of course, interview data, observational data, document data, and audio-visual data. So how do we analyze those data? We can use text analysis or image analysis. So for mixed method, of course, it's both predetermined and emerging method. It uses both open-ended and closed-ended questions. And there are multiple forms of data drawing on all possibilities. And the type of analysis that you get from mixed method are, of course, your statistical and text analysis. So in here, the practices of the researchers. So this is where we stand as researchers. What do we usually do? So the first one, in the quantitative approach, usually the practice of the researcher is either to test or verify theories. In here, we also try to identify the variables. And from the variables that we have identified, we try to make a hypothesis about it. And we have an objective standards of reliability and validity. So how can we ensure that the data we collected are reliable, especially the instrument used? And of course, the instrument used are also reliable and valid. So in quantitative, usually we write down the results in numerical information. So we observe and measures information numerically. And we try to be unbiased. We try to be unbiased or objective as possible because we use statistics. We use numbers to prove whether there are certain differences, significant differences, or there is no significant differences or relationship between a certain variable. In qualitative, we try to now position ourselves. Okay, we try to reflect upon our side, our biases there. So in qualitative, they recognize that, of course, in interpreting this certain data, there is a certain bias, of course, from the researcher. So it's important in quality that you recognize or you position yourself. and then collects participants' meanings. Okay, so again, it's based on the subjective view of the participants and usually focuses on a single phenomenon. It also brings personal values to the study. So that's why I said there's a certain bias. Okay, we cannot avoid bias in qualitative research because even though we try to be objective as much as possible, our values, our personal values, and the participants' values may, of course, be in conflict with each other. So, as much as possible, we try to be reflective. Okay, reflexivity, that's where reflexivity comes in, and recognizes our certain biases towards a certain group of people or our participants or towards a certain phenomena. We also try to validate the findings through how do we know that the participants' stories are, for example, credible. Okay, we try to look into whether they are really telling the truth. So there are different ways there later on that I will discuss in the course of our study of qualitative research. We also try to interpret the data. Okay, we can create an agenda for change. So this is especially for advocacy or participatory worldview. And we try to collaborate with the participants. So those are the usual practices of the researchers. So for mixed methods, so it collects both quantitative and qualitative data. It develops a rationale or nationale for why do we need to mix both quantitative and qualitative data. It integrates data at different stages and also presents visual pictures of the procedures. So it illustrates the how process of how did we collect the quantitative and the qualitative data and employs practices of both quantitative and qualitative research. So that's the mixed methods view or practice of the researchers. So for the research approaches now, okay, in summary of what we have learned, okay, so there are three primary research approaches that are based on four different worldviews, okay, the quantitative, the qualitative, and the mixed method. So in the quantitative research approach, we use post-positivist claims. So you usually look at the cause effects, the variables, the hypothesis. There's a certain measurement that we need to use. Okay, usually a psychological test to measure a certain variable. And then here we also try to test out theories. And it uses strategies such as experiments or surveys. So there are two research designs for quanti, experimental method and non-experimental method. And you usually collect predetermined data from instruments that yield statistical data. So for quali, we use constructivist, okay, meaning we look into the subjective experiences. There are multiple meanings, so meaning one person's meaning may be different to another, and it's usually socially constructed. So it means that a certain phenomenon or a certain event, okay, could change its meaning over time. It could also be advocacy or participatory, so it involves an action for change. So it uses the different kinds of research inquiries or designs such as narrative, phenomenology, ethnography, grounded theories, and case studies. And the data collection is usually open-ended and emerging data. For mixed method, so it primarily uses pragmatic claims, so it's problem-centered and it's usually leaning more into the results rather than the causes of a certain phenomenon. It uses strategies such as simultaneous or concurrent or sequential, and it collects both statistical and textual data. So usually, what are the research problems or how do we structure our questions when we want to use a certain approach? So how do we frame the problem? So first here in the quanti is to, of course, identify factors that influence a certain outcome, the utility of an intervention, or to understand the best predictors of a certain outcome. So usually, you try to look into, for example, what are the factors of productivity of students, okay, when it comes to studying online. So what are those factors that you want to look into? Utility of an intervention, like for example, how effective was a certain intervention given to than the other intervention, or to understand the best predictors of a certain outcome. So for example, a best predictors is, for example, if a certain test, for example, your comprehensive exam, does it predict your performance in the upcoming board exam? That's a example of how do we frame the research problem in the quantitative setting. What is important there is here we try to test a theory or explain a phenomenon, okay, using numbers. Okay. In Quali, we try to understand a concept or phenomenon or that is usually given little research on it. So this is most effective in certain populations that are rare, okay, more of exploratory. So we try to know the variables here compared to quantity that the variables are already determined, okay? And when the topic is new, the topic has not been addressed with a certain sample or group, or when theories do not apply with a certain sample, okay? So this is more of exploratory, okay? That's the way we frame the problem. And in mixed method, to capture the best quantitative and qualitative approaches, so it's trying to generalize findings and develop a detailed view of the meaning of the phenomenon. For example, if you have a quantitative data, so what's the meaning behind it? And you try to support it with the qualitative data. And same vice versa. If you have a qualitative data, okay, how do we generalize it? Okay, so this also first explores, then studies the variable. And either to also first survey many, then follow up on a few. So those are the different approaches to mixed methods and how do we frame the problem. So I think that's all for now. And I hope that you learned a lot about the importance of the worldviews or epistemology behind doing research. And just to reiterate, we are now changing our perspective. So from our approach in quantitative research that we are most likely very exposed to, we now take out that lens. Like my bus analogy, we try to change glasses from a quantitative approach, from a theory-based approach to a qualitative or a more exploratory approach. So again, my reference here is Creswell's book, and I really recommend you to read Creswell's book so that you can have a more deeper understanding of quanti, quali, and mixed approaches. And of course, the epistemology behind it. So I think that's all for our class, and see you on our next module, which is all about an introduction now to the different qualitative approaches. So see you and goodbye, everyone.